The morning of June 26, 1944, over the skies of southern Germany, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned toward their target at 23,000 feet. The bomber crews had been briefed on what to expect. Heavy flak over the target, German fighters climbing to intercept. The usual gauntlet that turned every mission into a mathematics problem of attrition. What they had not been briefed on, what nobody had told them explicitly, was the color of the fighter escorts that pulled into formation alongside them that morning. The P-51 Mustangs that slid into position wore red tails. Distinctive, impossible to miss. The pilots inside those aircraft were men from the 332nd Fighter Group. They were the Tuskegee Airmen. They were black. Some of the bomber crews had heard rumors. There had been talk in the ready rooms, conversations that stopped when officers walked past. The Army Air Forces had trained Negro pilots. They were flying combat missions now. They would be escorting bombers. The reactions among white bomber crews ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. These men had grown up in a segregated America. They had been taught, explicitly and implicitly, that black men were inferior, that they lacked the intelligence, the discipline, the courage for complex military operations, that they certainly could not be trusted with the lives of white airmen, and now their lives depended on these pilots. The bomber crews watched the red-tailed Mustangs take up escort positions. Close. Unusually close. Most fighter escorts maintained a loose formation, positioning themselves to intercept enemy fighters before they reached the bombers. They flew high and ahead, looking for kills, building their scores. The red tails were different. They stayed tight with the bombers. Wing to wing, so close that crews could see the pilots in their cockpits. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Over the next several months, something remarkable happened. Something that would challenge everything these bomber crews believed about race, about capability, about who deserved to wear the uniform. The crews began to notice a pattern. When the red tails escorted them, they came home. Not always. Warfare guaranteed nothing, but more often than with other escort groups, significantly more often, bomber crews started requesting the red tails specifically. Men who had grown up in segregated towns, who had never shaken hands with a black man, who had absorbed a lifetime of racist ideology, began to believe that these Negro pilots were the best escorts in the 15th Air Force. They began to trust them with their lives. More than that, they wanted them. The irony was profound and multi-layered. These white airmen, products of a deeply racist society, found themselves dependent on the very men that society had, deemed inferior. And those men, the Tuskegee Airmen, were proving something with every mission. Not just that they could fly, not just that they could fight, but that they would stay, that they would stick with the bombers no matter what, that they valued the mission, the protection of those bombers, above personal glory. This is the story of how that happened, of why the Tuskegee Airmen flew differently than other fighter groups, of what that choice cost them, and of how their tactics, born from necessity and shaped by the specific pressures of being black pilots in a white man's air force, created a reputation that would outlast the war and transform into legend. But to understand why their approach mattered, you have to understand what bomber crews faced over Europe in 1944. You have to understand the mathematics of survival at 20,000 feet. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe was industrial warfare at its most brutal and impersonal. Every day that the weather permitted, hundreds of bombers took off from bases in England and Italy, formed into massive formations, and flew deep into German-controlled territory. Their targets were oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail yards, anything that sustained the German war machine. The bombers were heavy aircraft, designed to carry tons of explosives over hundreds of miles. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the workhorse of the 8th Air Force based in England, had a crew of 10 men, 4 engines, 13 50 caliber machine guns for defensive armament. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs depending on the mission distance. The B-24 Liberator, used extensively by the 15th Air Force based in Italy, was similar in concept but different in execution. It carried a larger bomb load, had longer range, but was more difficult to fly and more vulnerable to battle damage. Both aircraft were marvels of engineering. Both were flying coffins when German fighters found them. The defensive armament looked impressive on paper. 13 guns on a B-17. But the reality was more complex. The guns had limited arcs of fire. Coordinating defensive fire required communication and discipline that broke down quickly in combat. The waist gunners stood in a freezing, unpressurized fuselage, wearing bulky flight suits and oxygen masks, trying to track fighters moving at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour. German fighter pilots knew the weak points. They knew the B-17 had limited defensive fire from directly ahead. They developed tactics specifically to exploit this. The head-on attack, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing cannons and machine guns into the bomber's nose. At those speeds, the attack lasted seconds. The German pilot would fire, break away, and the bomber would either continue flying or begin the long fall to earth. If the pilot was killed, if the controls were shot away, if fire broke out, if the oxygen system was damaged, if any of 100 critical systems failed, the bomber went down. The crew might bail out if they had time and altitude. They might survive the parachute descent and become prisoners of war. Or they might die in the aircraft, 10 men trapped in a metal tube that was tumbling toward the ground. The statistics were merciless. In 1943 and early 1944, the loss rates for bomber crews were catastrophic. The 8th Air Force, flying from England, lost 4,000 bombers in 1943 alone. Some missions had loss rates exceeding 25%. That meant 1 in 4 bombers that took off did not return. A bomber crew was required to complete 25 missions to finish their tour and rotate home. Later in the war, this was increased to 35 missions. The mathematics were simple and terrible. If every mission had a 5% loss rate, which was not unusual, the probability of surviving 25 missions was less than 30%. Most crews would not make it home. The men who flew these missions knew the odds. They lived with the knowledge that their survival was statistical, that every mission brought them closer to either completion of their tour or death. They watched other crews fail to return. They saw the empty bunks in the barracks. They attended memorial services for friends who had been alive at breakfast. This was the psychological environment in which bomber crews operated. Constant awareness of mortality, absolute dependence on factors beyond their control, the weather, the accuracy of intelligence, the competence of their escorts, and perhaps most frustrating, the knowledge that their survival often depended on fighter pilots who seemed more interested in building their personal kill counts than in protecting the bombers. Fighter pilots lived in a different world than bomber crews. They flew alone or in small formations. Their aircraft were nimble, responsive, capable of speeds that heavy bombers could never match. They fought individual duels in 3 dimensions. Their survival depended on skill, reflexes, and split-second decisions. The American fighter pilot culture, by 1944, was heavily influenced by concepts of individual achievement. Aces were celebrated. The pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft earned the title and the recognition that came with it. Newspapers ran stories about aces. Their photos appeared in magazines. They received medals and promotions. This created incentives that did not always align with the mission of protecting bombers. A fighter pilot escorting bombers had 2 choices when enemy fighters appeared. He could maintain position with the bombers, engaging any enemy aircraft that directly threatened them. Or he could pursue enemy fighters aggressively, chasing them away from the bomber formation, hunting for kills. The second option was more exciting. It offered the possibility of victories, of building a score, of becoming an ace. It also meant leaving the bombers. If you pursued an enemy fighter that was diving away, you left a gap in the escort. Other enemy fighters could exploit that gap. The bombers became more vulnerable. Many fighter groups adopted tactics that prioritized aggressive pursuit. They positioned themselves high and ahead of the bomber formation. When enemy fighters appeared, they dove to engage, chasing the Germans away from the bombers and seeking opportunities for kills. This approach had a logic. If you destroyed enough German fighters, if you shot them down or forced them to break off, the bombers were safer. But it also created gaps. The escort became fragmented. German fighters, working in coordinated groups, could exploit these gaps. They could feint an attack, drawing off part of the escort, then strike the bombers from another direction with the fighters they had held in reserve. Bomber crews understood this dynamic. They understood that some fighter pilots cared more about their personal scores than about protecting bombers. They understood that the fighter jock culture, the emphasis on individual kills and ace status, sometimes worked against their survival, and they resented it. The resentment was rarely spoken openly. Fighter pilots and bomber crews did not socialize much. They flew different aircraft, faced different dangers, lived in different psychological spaces. But the bomber crews talked among themselves. They compared notes on which fighter groups stayed with them and which disappeared the moment enemy fighters appeared. They developed preferences. This was the context in which the Tuskegee Airmen entered combat operations. They were arriving at a moment when the tension between fighter tactics and bomber protection was well understood. They were joining an air force that had already established its culture and its priorities. And they were doing so as black men in a military that was segregated by policy and racist by culture. Everything about their situation was different. They had been trained separately at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. They had faced discrimination throughout their training. They had been told, explicitly and implicitly, that they were not wanted, that they were an experiment, that white pilots and white bomber crews did not want them there. They arrived in Italy in February 1944 and began flying combat missions with the 15th Air Force. Their initial missions were ground attack and bomber escort in the Mediterranean theater. By June, they were flying deep penetration escort missions into Germany and Eastern Europe, and from the beginning, they flew differently. The 332nd Fighter Group developed their tactical approach not from official doctrine, but from necessity, and from the specific pressures of their position. They were under scrutiny in ways that white fighter groups were not. Every mission was evaluated not just as a military operation, but as evidence in an ongoing argument about whether black men could serve as combat pilots. Failure was not just personal or professional. Failure would be used as proof that the entire experiment of black aviation was misguided. Success had to be unambiguous. They could not afford the luxury of ambiguity that white units enjoyed. A white fighter group that lost bombers could point to circumstances, to overwhelming enemy numbers, to bad luck. The Tuskegee Airmen knew that any bombers lost under their escort would be interpreted differently. This created a different calculus. The emphasis on personal achievement, on building individual scores and becoming aces, was secondary to the primary mission. Protect the bombers. Stay with them. Do not leave gaps in the escort. Do not pursue enemy fighters beyond the point where you lose sight of the bombers you are protecting. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded the 332nd Fighter Group, understood this, implicitly. Davis was the son of Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., the first black general in the United States Army. He had graduated from West Point in 1932, enduring 4 years of organized ostracism where white cadets refused to speak to him except when required by duty. He had spent his entire military career proving himself in an institution designed to exclude men who looked like him. Davis implemented what became known as the close escort doctrine. His pilots would maintain tight formation with the bombers. They would position themselves at the same altitude or slightly above, close enough that bomber crews could see them. They would not chase German fighters that broke away. They would not pursue kills beyond the immediate protection zone of the bombers. This was not the glamorous fighter-pilot warfare that filled the newspapers and newsreels. It was disciplined, unglamorous work. It required pilots to suppress their aggressive instincts, to watch enemy fighters escape rather than pursuing them, to accept that they would shoot down fewer aircraft than pilots in other groups who hunted more aggressively. The pilots of the 332nd understood what they were being asked to do. Some resented it. They were fighter pilots. They wanted to fight. They wanted kills. They wanted the recognition that came with ace status. But they also understood the larger context. They were not just fighting Germans. They were fighting for the right of black men to serve as equals in the American military. Captain Lee Archer, who flew with the 332nd, later described the philosophy in direct terms. The mission was to bring the bombers home, not to build personal scores, not to become aces, though some did. The mission was bomber protection, executed with discipline and consistency. This approach had costs. The Tuskegee Airmen produced fewer aces than other fighter groups. By the end of the war, the group had fewer than 10 pilots who achieved ace status, compared to dozens in some other groups. Individual kill counts were lower. The opportunities for the dramatic aerial victories that made careers and reputations were deliberately foregone. But the bombers came home. Not always. No escort could guarantee that. But more consistently than with many other fighter groups, the bomber crews noticed. They began talking about it. The red tails stayed with you. They did not abandon you to chase kills. They were there when German fighters came in for the attack. By late 1944, something remarkable was happening. Bomber crews were requesting the red tails specifically. They were asking for the Tuskegee Airmen to escort their missions. White airmen, men who had grown up in a society that taught them black men were inferior, were stating explicitly that they wanted these particular pilots protecting them. The requests came through informal channels at first. A bomber squadron commander would mention to operations that his crews preferred the red tails. A group commander would note in his report that the 332nd provided excellent escort. The preferences accumulated. The pattern became undeniable. This created a curious situation. The official military remained segregated. Black and white servicemen ate in separate facilities, slept in separate quarters, used separate recreational areas. The military justified this segregation with claims that integration would harm unit cohesion and effectiveness, that white soldiers would not trust black soldiers in combat, that racial mixing would create more problems than it solved. Yet in the air, where trust was measured in life and death rather than in theories and prejudices, white bomber crews were demonstrating through their choices that they trusted black pilots more than they trusted many white pilots. The contradiction was obvious to everyone involved. The reputation of the Tuskegee Airmen spread through the bomber groups of the 15th Air Force in the latter half of 1944. It spread through the informal networks that existed in any military organization. Crews talked. They compared experiences. They shared information that never appeared in official reports. A typical conversation might occur in the enlisted men's mess after a mission. A waist gunner from one crew would mention to a waist gunner from another crew that they had red tails escort that day. The bombers all came back. No losses to fighters. The red tails stuck with them the whole way. Another crew might report a different experience with a different fighter group. The escorts engaged German fighters early, pursued them, and left gaps in the formation. The Germans came back with a second wave and got through to the bombers. 2 aircraft lost. These conversations accumulated. The anecdotes built into a pattern. The pattern became belief. The red tails were the best escorts. They stayed with you. They brought you home. The statistical reality was more complex than the mythology that developed. The 332nd Fighter Group did lose bombers under their escort. Modern historical research, examining mission reports and casualty records, has documented approximately 25 to 27 bomber losses during missions escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen. This represented a loss rate lower than the average for the 15th Air Force, but not zero. The mythology of never losing a bomber, which became part of the Tuskegee Airmen legend and persists in popular memory today, was an exaggeration born from genuine respect and from the selective nature of memory. Crews remembered the missions where everything went right. They remembered seeing the red tails stay close when other escorts might have left. They remembered coming home when they expected to die. But the mythology reflected an underlying truth about tactics and priorities. The 332nd Fighter Group did fly closer escort than most other groups. They did prioritize bomber protection over fighter kills. They did have a lower bomber loss rate. The exaggeration of this record into perfection was perhaps inevitable, given the context. For bomber crews facing missions with 20 or 30% loss rates, the difference between a 5% loss rate and a 2% loss rate was not statistical abstraction. It was survival. If the red tails reduced your chances of dying from 1 in 5 to 1 in 20, that felt miraculous. That felt like never losing a bomber, even if the statistics said otherwise. The bomber crews did not have access to comprehensive statistics. They had their experience and the experiences of crews they talked to. Those experiences told them the red tails were different, better, more reliable, worth requesting specifically. By early 1945, the preference for the Tuskegee Airmen among bomber crews was well established. Official reports began noting it. A February 1945 report from the 15th Air Force mentioned that bomber crews specifically requested the 332nd Fighter Group for escort duty. The report noted the group's effective tactics and low loss rates. This official acknowledgement was significant. The military did not casually praise black units. The default assumption throughout the segregated military was that black soldiers were less capable, less disciplined, less effective than white soldiers. This assumption was policy. It justified segregation. It justified limiting black soldiers to support roles rather than combat roles. It justified the entire structure of racial hierarchy within the military. The Tuskegee Airmen's reputation directly contradicted this assumption. It provided evidence that black soldiers could not only perform combat roles, but could excel at them. That they could earn the trust and respect of white soldiers based purely on merit and performance. This evidence was dangerous to the system of segregation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The response from military leadership was complex. On one hand, the 332nd Fighter Group received recognition. They were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation for a mission on March 24, 1945, where they escorted bombers to Berlin and engaged German fighters effectively. This was a prestigious award, given only to units that displayed extraordinary heroism. On the other hand, the broader implications of their success were largely ignored or minimized. The military did not desegregate. The lessons that might have been drawn, that segregation was based on prejudice rather than performance, that black soldiers deserved equal treatment and opportunity, were not officially acknowledged. The Tuskegee Airmen continued flying missions through the end of the European War. They escorted bombers to targets across Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans. They engaged German fighters. They conducted ground attack missions. They performed every mission assigned to them with the same discipline and competence that had built their reputation. The close escort doctrine that earned the Tuskegee Airmen their reputation came with costs that were rarely discussed in the mythology that developed after the war. Staying tight with the bombers meant accepting tactical disadvantages. It meant fighting at the bomber's altitude and speed rather than positioning yourself for optimal combat. It meant sometimes taking hits that more aggressively positioned escorts might have avoided. Lieutenant Clarence Lucky, Lester flew with the 332nd Fighter Group and later described the frustration of watching German fighters escape because doctrine required staying with the bombers. As a fighter pilot, every instinct demanded pursuit. The enemy was right there, vulnerable, and you had to let him go because your responsibility was to the bombers. This discipline was hard-won. It required training and constant reinforcement. It required pilots to override their aggressive instincts and their desire for personal glory. It required them to accept that they would have fewer kills, fewer opportunities for recognition, less chance of becoming aces. The pilots understood why this was necessary. They understood the political context of their service, but understanding did not make it easy. They were fighter pilots. They wanted to fight on their terms. The close escort doctrine required them to fight on the bombers' terms. The physical danger was also distributed differently. Fighter pilots who positioned themselves high and ahead of the bomber formation, who engaged German fighters early and pursued them aggressively, certainly faced danger. But they faced it in high-speed combat, where their aircraft's superior performance gave them advantages. Pilots flying close escort at bomber altitude and speed faced danger in a more constrained tactical environment. They were slower than they would be at higher altitude. They had less energy for maneuvering. If German fighters bounced them from above, they had less ability to respond effectively. The 332nd Fighter Group lost pilots in combat. 27 pilots from the group were killed in action during the war. Others were shot down and became prisoners of war. The close escort doctrine did not make them invulnerable. It simply shifted where and how they faced danger. Captain Wendell Pruitt was one of the most accomplished pilots in the group, credited with destroying multiple enemy aircraft in air combat. On April 15, 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended, Pruitt was killed in a training accident in Italy. He was 21 years old. His death highlighted the constant danger pilots faced, even outside of combat operations. First Lieutenant Robert Days was shot down over Austria in March 1945 during a bomber escort mission. He survived the bailout and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. His experience was shared by dozens of other Tuskegee Airmen who were shot down and captured. The prisoners faced additional challenges beyond those that white American prisoners faced. They were black men in Nazi custody. The Nazis' racial ideology placed black people near the bottom of their racial hierarchy. Treatment varied. Some black prisoners reported being treated relatively well by German military captors who followed Geneva Convention protocols. Others reported harassment and threats. All of them lived with uncertainty about how their race would affect their treatment. For families back home, the experience of having a loved one in combat was complicated by the racial dynamics of wartime America. The families of Tuskegee Airmen were proud of their sons and husbands who were serving as pilots. But they also lived in communities where black people faced discrimination, violence, and legal segregation. They read newspapers that celebrated white aces while often ignoring black pilots' achievements. They knew their loved ones were fighting for a country that denied them basic civil rights. The city of Tuskegee, Alabama, where the pilots had trained, was itself deeply segregated. Black residents could not use the same facilities as white residents. They could not vote in most elections due to discriminatory laws and practices. They faced the constant threat of violence for stepping outside the bounds of acceptable behavior as defined by white supremacy. The pilots themselves experienced this contradiction directly. They would complete combat missions over Europe, flying complex aircraft in life-or-death situations, demonstrating skill and courage. Then they would return to base and face segregation in their own military. They ate in separate facilities. They could not socialize with white pilots. When they went on leave, they faced discrimination in towns near their bases. Some Italian communities, less bound by American racial ideology, treated the black pilots with less discrimination than they experienced from white American soldiers. There are accounts of Tuskegee Airmen being welcomed in Italian homes and treated with respect by Italian civilians who saw them simply as American soldiers rather than through the lens of American racial categories. This created strange situations where black pilots felt more comfortable among the people whose country they were helping to defeat than among their own fellow American servicemen. The absurdity was not lost on the pilots themselves. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown their last combat missions. They had completed over 1,500 missions, including approximately 200 bomber escort missions, deep into German-held territory. Their record was remarkable by any measure, but it was the mythology that would outlast the statistics. The story that emerged in the immediate post-war years was simple and powerful. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. They were the best escorts in the Air Force. White bomber crews requested them specifically because they brought everyone home. This narrative was not entirely accurate, but it was rooted in truth. The exaggeration served a purpose. For Black Americans in the 1940s and 50s, the Tuskegee Airmen represented proof of capability and excellence in the face of a system designed to deny both. The mythology of perfection, of never losing a bomber, was more powerful than the more complex statistical reality. It became a weapon against segregation and discrimination. When civil rights advocates argued for integration, when they challenged the military's continued segregation after World War II, they pointed to the Tuskegee Airmen. Here was undeniable evidence that black soldiers could perform at the highest levels, that they could earn the trust and respect of white soldiers based on merit. That segregation was based on prejudice rather than on any real differences in capability. The military itself was slow to acknowledge these lessons. Despite the evidence from the Tuskegee Airmen and from other black units that had performed well in combat, the military remained segregated after the war ended. Black soldiers continued to serve in separate units. They continued to face discrimination in assignment, promotion, and recognition. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9880 on July 26, 1948, ordering the desegregation of the military. The order stated that there would be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This was 3 years after the war ended. 3 years, during which the military had time to examine the evidence and continued to maintain segregation anyway. The implementation of Truman's order was gradual and resisted. Some military leaders argued that integration would harm unit cohesion. This was the same argument that had been used to justify segregation during the war, an argument that the Tuskegee Airmen's record directly contradicted. But institutional racism does not yield easily to evidence. The Korean War, which began in 1950, accelerated integration by necessity. Combat casualties created manpower shortages. Segregated units could not be maintained efficiently when replacements were needed immediately, regardless of race. Field commanders integrated their units informally, assigning soldiers where they were needed rather than maintaining racial separation. By 1954, the military was officially integrated, though informal discrimination continued in many forms. The Tuskegee Airmen had helped make this possible. Their wartime record provided evidence that could not be dismissed. Their mythology, the simplified story of perfection, was a tool for change. The individual pilots returned to civilian life and faced the same discrimination they had known before the war. They had fought for their country. They had proven themselves in combat. They came home to a country where they still could not vote in many states, where they faced legal segregation, where they were denied basic civil rights. Some became involved in the civil rights movement. They used their status as veterans, as decorated pilots, as men who had served their country with distinction to challenge discrimination. Others simply tried to build lives for themselves and their families in a society that continued to limit opportunities for Black Americans. Charles McGee, who flew with the Tuskegee Airmen and later flew combat missions in Korea and Vietnam, eventually retired as a colonel. He lived to see himself honored at a State of the Union address in 2020, at age 100. His presence was a reminder of the long arc between the segregated military of World War II and a present that, while imperfect, had changed fundamentally. Lee Archer, who had described the bomber protection mission, faced discrimination after the war when he tried to pursue a career in commercial aviation. Airlines were not hiring black pilots in the 1940s and 50s. He eventually built a successful business career, but the door to the cockpits of commercial aircraft remained closed for decades. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen became embedded in American memory as a story of excellence overcoming prejudice. Schools taught it, books were written, movies were made. The red-tailed P-51 Mustang became an icon. The mythology, simplified and perfected, served educational purposes and inspirational purposes. Modern historical research has complicated the simple narrative. Historians examining primary sources, mission reports, and casualty records have documented that the 332nd Fighter Group did lose bombers under Escort. The exact number varies depending on how losses are counted and which missions are included, but approximately 25 bombers were lost to enemy action during missions where the Tuskegee Airmen provided escort. This discovery has led to debates about the mythology versus the reality. Some argue that the simplified story of never losing a bomber is false and should be corrected. Others argue that the mythology, while not literally accurate, reflects a deeper truth about the group's tactics and effectiveness. The statistical reality shows that the 332nd Fighter Group had a lower bomber loss rate than the average for the 15th Air Force. They protected their charges more effectively than many other escort groups. The bomber crew's preference for the Red Tails was based on real differences in tactics and outcomes, not on imagination or propaganda. The close escort doctrine that Colonel Davis implemented was genuinely different from the more common tactics of other fighter groups. The emphasis on staying with the bombers, on prioritizing protection over kills, did result in fewer bomber losses. The bombers did come home more consistently. The mythology exaggerated this into perfection, but the underlying reality was genuine achievement. Understanding this complexity does not diminish the Tuskegee Airmen's accomplishments. If anything, it makes their story more remarkable. They succeeded not through perfection, which is impossible in war, but through discipline, skill, and a tactical approach shaped by the unique pressures of their position. They were black pilots in a white man's air force. They were under constant scrutiny. They knew that failure would be used to justify continued segregation and discrimination. They responded not by avoiding risk, but by accepting a doctrine that required them to sacrifice personal glory for mission success. The costs of this approach were real. Fewer aces meant less individual recognition. Staying at bomber altitude meant accepting tactical disadvantages. The pilots who flew close escort put themselves in harm's way just as surely as pilots who flew more aggressive tactics, just in different ways. 27 Tuskegee Airmen died in combat. Others were shot down and captured. Others survived the war but carried physical and psychological scars. The mythology of never losing a bomber sometimes overshadowed their actual sacrifices. It made their achievement seem almost easy, as if they had flown through the war without facing real danger or paying real costs. The truth is more complex and more human. They were men doing a difficult and dangerous job under circumstances that added extra layers of pressure and meaning. They succeeded not through superhuman perfection, but through professionalism and discipline. They made choices about tactics and priorities that reflected their understanding of what was at stake. The bomber crews who requested them, who trusted them with their lives, were not responding to mythology. They were responding to experience. They knew the Red Tails stayed close. They knew the loss rates were lower. They knew, even if they did not articulate it consciously, that these pilots were flying a different kind of mission than many other escorts. The white bomber crews who requested black escorts were participating, perhaps unknowingly, in a challenge to the racial ideology that shaped their society. They were demonstrating through their choices that race was not a meaningful predictor of capability or trustworthiness. That the prejudices they had been taught were wrong, that black men could be trusted with the most important thing, their lives. This realization did not always translate into broader changes in attitudes. Some white bomber crews who trusted black pilots in combat returned home and continued to support segregation in civilian life. The human capacity for compartmentalization is remarkable, but for others, the experience planted seeds of doubt about the racial ideology they had been taught. The Tuskegee Airmen themselves carried complex feelings about their wartime experience, pride in their achievements, anger at the discrimination they faced, frustration that their success did not immediately translate into equality, hope that their service would contribute to broader change, grief for the friends they lost. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen and their close escort doctrine is ultimately a story about choices made under pressure. It is about how the specific circumstances of being black pilots in a segregated military shaped their tactical approach. It is about how that tactical approach earned them a reputation that challenged the assumptions underlying segregation itself. The irony at the heart of this story is profound. The military segregated black soldiers because it believed integration would harm effectiveness and cohesion. White soldiers, the theory went, would not trust black soldiers in combat. Racial mixing would create friction and failure. Yet, in the air over Europe, where trust was measured in survival rather than in theories, white bomber crews demonstrated through their choices that they trusted black pilots. They trusted them specifically because those pilots had proven themselves more reliable than many white pilots. The segregationist ideology predicted exactly the opposite of what actually happened. This irony was not lost on the participants. The Tuskegee Airmen understood that every successful mission was an argument against segregation. The bomber crews who requested red-tailed escorts were, whether they realized it or not, participating in that argument. The evidence was being compiled mission by mission, bomber by bomber. The broader significance extends beyond the immediate question of military segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen's story is about how systems of oppression create pressures that sometimes produce unexpected results. They were placed under extraordinary scrutiny. They responded with extraordinary discipline. The pressure that was meant to prove their inferiority instead produced evidence of excellence. This pattern repeats throughout history. Groups that face discrimination often develop strengths specifically because they must work harder to achieve the same recognition. They must be better, more disciplined, more professional, because failure is interpreted as group failure rather than individual failure. The Tuskegee Airmen embodied this dynamic. Their choice to prioritize bomber protection over personal glory was tactical and practical, but it was also shaped by their understanding of what was at stake. They were not just fighting a war against Germany. They were fighting for recognition, for respect, for the right to serve as equals. Every bomber they brought home was evidence in that fight. The mythology that developed after the war, the story of never losing a bomber, served a purpose in the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s. It was a simple, powerful narrative that could be deployed against segregation and discrimination. It was not perfectly accurate, but it pointed to a truth. Black Americans could achieve excellence in any field if given the opportunity. The more complex historical reality, discovered through careful research decades later, does not diminish this truth. It complicates it, adds nuance, acknowledges costs and sacrifices. But the fundamental achievement remains. The Tuskegee Airmen flew combat missions with distinction. They earned the trust of the bomber crews they protected. They challenged segregation through performance. The white bomber crews who climbed into their B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds on that June morning in 1944 did not know they were participating in a story that would echo through decades. They knew only that they had a dangerous mission ahead and that the escorts assigned to them were black pilots they had been taught to distrust. Over the following months, those crews learned something that contradicted their training and their society's teachings. They learned that the red tails stayed with them, that these black pilots flew with discipline and skill, that they came home more often when the red tails were overhead. This knowledge, gained at 20,000 feet over hostile territory, was a form of education that no amount of propaganda could counter. It was concrete, it was repeated, it was undeniable. The men who experienced it carried that knowledge forward, even if they did not always know what to do with it. The Tuskegee Airmen returned home to face continued discrimination. But they had proven something that could not be unproven. They had demonstrated capability and earned trust from the very people who were supposed to never trust them. They had flown wing to wing with bombers and brought them home. They had done so with professionalism and discipline, and at costs that were rarely acknowledged in the mythology that followed. Their achievement was not perfection. It was something more valuable and more human. It was excellence sustained under extraordinary pressure. It was tactical discipline that prioritized mission over ego. It was service performed with full knowledge that recognition would be limited and that discrimination would continue. The story that began with skeptical bomber crews watching red-tailed Mustangs pull into formation ended with those same crews requesting those escorts specifically. That transformation, that earned trust, was the real achievement, not the mythology of perfection, but the reality of men who did their jobs well enough to change minds through performance alone. They flew wing to wing. They stayed with the bombers. They brought them home often enough that bomber crews believed they always did. And in doing so, they helped dismantle, one mission at a time, the ideology that said they could not be trusted with such responsibilities in the first place. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.